So yes, thank you so much for having me today. It's a great pleasure to be presenting amidst a really quite impressive lineup of colleagues who are interested in these sorts of very important issues. So I'll be presenting still a working paper called "The Self is Always Already a We: Navigating Multi-Species Assemblages Amid the Anthropocene." So my background originally was in sociology. Now currently I work more around radical environmental politics and critical posthuman theory. But that should sort of become a bit more apparent as I move through. So just to shed light a little bit on where I come from as a researcher. So just for a bit of context, although I'm sure most, if not all of us, are already aware of a lot of these sort of kind of genre and boundary defying crises that we presently face, but multiple socio-ecological perturbations amidst the Anthropocene, which is what puts all of these questions that we're addressing today into sort of the spotlight and what makes them so important to discuss. And particularly we've seen what they refer to as in the literature is referred to as the post-1950s Great Acceleration era. So especially in the post-war period, we've seen almost meteoric rises in consumption and production patterns. And of course, this is important to note, this is mainly amongst the quite social justice issues around the global North and South divide. The planet's wealthy elite in particular are associated, their consumption patterns are associated with significant environmental impacts. So there are, just to keep in mind, there are significant imbalances within the question of the Anthropocene or who's responsible for what we're seeing now. But you know, kind of a number of issues, especially the sixth mass extinction, which ties into a lot of what we're concerned about, especially those of us who are interested in veganism as one way to address all of these issues. And of course, as we've recently seen with the novel zoonotic diseases like COVID, hence the virtual nature of this conference, quite a lot of transformations we're currently experiencing. And what's interesting about this, theoretically at least, is that on the one hand, we are seeing a ubiquitous human presence, human agency. So humans, even though certain humans are more responsible than others, humans as a species are overwhelmingly responsible for a lot of these planetary perturbations. However, we're also seeing the reactions by non-humans, violent reactions in the form of hurricanes, rising seas, COVID, for instance, fighting back and sort of reacting, not just so that we're not just seeing this idea, this long-standing notion that nature is this passive, objective foundation to our actions, but it reacts. Other species react to what we're doing. And so one significant driver, at least according to a lot of critical posthuman theorists and myself included, one of the key drivers of this, in addition to socioeconomic activity, are what we've already quite a few times alluded to other speakers as anthropocentrism. So very deep rooted, particularly in Western societies. But it's the notion that humans are in some way separate from the natural world, separate from non-humans, and more importantly, superior. And that therefore, this gives us the right to treat non-humans and the natural world in any way we desire. So this has taken a variety of different forms historically, but the more famous approach is the Cartesian figure of the mindless, soulless automata, that other species, for instance, Kant, that only rational beings deserve to be treated as ends in themselves. So this, by default, means that anything deemed non-rational, i.e. Animals, are simply objects, things to be used, commodities, things to be exploited. They're not subjects. They have, we owe them no ethical responsibility or obligations. Another way to phrase this is that historically and presently, non-humans, the natural world, has been depicted as something that is seen but not seeing. They don't have any sort of meaningful way to construct the world. That's the sort of job of the rational subjects, i.e. people, humans. And so the non-human world has been depicted as lacking any agency or power to shape phenomena independent of a human subject to afford them any value or any meaning. So in a number of different realms, as we're this sort of not only in terms of human values and how we view the natural world, but within various academic disciplines. For instance, the history of political thought, animals, non-humans have been depicted as something on the periphery. So humans have been seen as the center of the cosmopolitical universe. Within sociological inquiry or notions of society or the social, still to a significant degree plagued by the kind of modern society-nature schism, the idea that the focus is on the social, that is populated by human subjects, and animals and other species, when they do figure, are simply there as resources or as objects or as things that we protect only because we need them for our own continuity. And so as a whole, the discipline still kind of is plagued by that idea of human exceptionalism. Humans are the central focus and everything else is secondary. And of course, ethics, when we think about ethics, which is the sort of the area that I'm particularly interested in as well, the idea of how you ought to relate to others, how you ought to treat others. Non-humans are also often secondary in these considerations. They're regarded typically as objects, resources to be used by humans. They are not typically deemed to be ethical subjects to whom we owe any kind of responsibilities. But aside from the ethically problematic nature of these long-standing assumptions, ontologically, these approaches are false. So there is no such thing as an independent self or an independent entity, whether you're talking about a human, an elephant, or even a zooplankton, for instance. So the self and the other, they're fundamentally intertwined. They always are. We're always a being in common, of singularities, no doubt. So individuals are created by the numerous relationships that we are always enmeshed in. But there is no such thing as a self without the other. And so if you look at, for instance, the composition of the human microbiome, of our skin, of the sort of everything that's part of our actual body, we are composed of thousands of species of microbial symbionts that constitute the human. They are part of our DNA, our skin. They help regulate our immune system. And so, in kind of thinking in sort of other realms, we're entangled with photosynthesizers through respiration, process of respiration, and the fact that we're dependent on photosynthetic organisms like trees, phytoplankton, cyanobacteria, without whom we literally would not be. And if you think more broadly in terms of the social, our socioeconomic systems, I've always been predicated on animals, thinking the pivotal role played by horses, for instance, in the Industrial Revolution, and the fact that fossil capitalism literally runs on the remains of ancient beings that have been buried through time. So the human is a fundamentally hybrid entity. There is no such thing as a self independent of the other. So the self essentially in this sense, is always already a we. And so I think this sentiment, this idea is has never been as obvious, or perhaps something that's increasingly becoming sort of coming to the forefront than during the Anthropocene, where we're seeing a number of boundaries completely obliterated. So rising seas are going to rewrite national boundaries. We're seeing with COVID completely shattering spatial and temporal scales, bringing entire economies to their knees. It's an area of widespread and fundamental transformation. And this brings to light how fundamentally dependent we are on others, and how tied we are with the non-human. And so these transformations, I think, bring to light, or they sort of shed light on some fundamental questions and fundamental transformations that are needed. So not only do we need to radically reconstruct our economies and socioeconomic systems to run on renewable energy, for instance, to move away from fossil energy, but I think crucially, fundamental changes in values and ontological, ethical orientations. And that sort of then feeds into how we go about addressing policy changes, academic inquiry, and then the fundamental question, I think, of the Anthropocene, which is how do we live well with others, with Earth others, with these other species? How do we navigate these sort of difficult and changing terrain ahead? And I'll just focus on a few examples because I'm conscious of time, but so because of the nature of this conference, sociological inquiry, for instance. So one approach that's quite important and is underway, but I think we need to sort of, this area needs a bit more attention, is to decenter the human within sociological inquiry. So this is quite a nice quote, I think, in this respect, but there's virtually no area of social life that is untouched by humans. So again, traditionally, of course, sociology, the focus of it has been the relation between the individual, human individual, and the wider society, the focus on relations, on interpersonal relations. And a shift, I think, is needed to address the number of crises we're facing, to include the non-human and how the non-human interacts with humans and in various different ways in different sort of spaces. And so, again, drawing on critical posthuman theory, this would be an interesting way to sort of expand on these questions by perhaps having a critical posthuman turn within sociological inquiry. And in particular, radical reconceptualization of the core concepts within sociological inquiry, such as society, relationality, agency. So the idea that humans are agents and non-humans are objects has to be reconfigured. We are in a world full of people, only some of whom are human. And of course, reorientation of sociological inquiry to include the ways in which agentic non-humans co-constitute the social. And so essentially radically reconceptualizing the idea that the social is something that includes not just humans, and how we sort of co-create these different worlds, particularly amidst the current context of the Anthropocene, where, as I mentioned, these number of transformations that we're seeing, many of which are not just by us, by sort of our actions, but by retaliations by non-humans. And of course, as the sort of the vegan question is quite an important one within this context as well, an absolutely vital endeavor. I myself have been sort of oscillating between veganism and vegetarianism for about 10 years now. But I draw on the work of the ecofeminist philosopher, the late ecofeminist philosopher Val Plumwood, because she sort of does quite a lot of work on the question of veganism and vegetarianism. And I think a critical approach is warranted here because, and alluding to what Roger was talking about earlier in terms of the kind of the clash between different ideas around veganism, and something that I've heard myself personally in some certain circles, and a notion floating around that perhaps with the vegan question that eating animals is inherently problematic, or what Plumwood refers to as ontological veganism, the notion that we have to have this radical separation. So the notion that veganism is about consuming plants only, and then there is a radical sort of divide drawn between animals and plants, and anything outside of that is problematic. However, she makes the sort of claim that eating animals is not inherently problematic. Consumption of others is a fundamental aspect of how ecosystem functions. What is problematic, highly problematic, is the exploitation and reduction of animals to commodities through industrial capitalist food production systems in particular. But alluding back to the notion that I mentioned previously, that boundaries are always permeable, they're always shifting, and this is what we're seeing especially now within the Anthropocene. The notion, that kind of argument that you see sometimes that veganism is a complete abstention from animal products or the animal, or intersecting with animals in that sense. It's problematic because it risks that reproduction of that dualism, the idea that humans are here on one side in the social, in cultural realms, and animals and other species are elsewhere. So, and this also can be tied to argument that, for instance, predation is problematic, which is a rare idea, but it has surfaced, and I think it can be quite dangerous. And so what Plumwood is interested in doing is deconstructing these dualisms and arguing for an approach to veganism that is context specific and sort of promotes the idea that it is highly important, and especially within the current context with the link with food production systems that are centered around the use of animals and their links to climate change, for instance, and the numerous horrors that these species are subject to. But to keep in mind that this logic of dualism is potentially reproduced when you have this approach, this dualistic approach. And this is something that's also seen in what's referred to as fortress conservation. So sociobiologists like E.O. Wilson, for instance, many of you might have heard the half-Earth proposal, the idea that we need to set aside roughly half of the Earth's habitable land surface to sort of create mass preserves to preserve and protect biodiversity, which potentially could be something that's needed, but what's problematic here is that it rests on that assumption that humans go in one area and animals are radically separate and placed somewhere elsewhere. And that this notion is very problematic because this doesn't exist. There is nowhere where we exist and other species are not. We, like other animals, are part of really complex and dynamic ecosystems and wider biospheric processes, which are also fundamentally based on consumption and various other different kinds of partnerships and relationships that need not be exploitative, even though they currently are within the current context. So I'll kind of breeze through this because I'm conscious I'm running out of time. But so Plumwood, one of her sort of solutions to this is what she refers to as dialogical interspecies ethics. So what she attempts to do is theorize how a radically new relationship with other species could work within a context like the Anthropocene, for instance. So she's adamant that we need to move from relations based on domination and exploitation to dialogical, responsive, and carefully negotiated relationships with planetary partners. And that's an important phrase because it reminds us that we are co-inhabitants, we are co-evolutionary kin, we're family members, and neither of us are objects for us to exploit, sorry. And so she sort of argues for the idea, the need for a fundamental deconstruction of these anthropocentric prejudices, these hyper separations between humans and other species, and that we exist in mosaics that are constantly shifting with others all the time. And there is no such thing, as I mentioned, between a place where you can have a nature preserve and human habitations in another area. So the idea is to view Earth others as fellow agents rather than things that are radically separate. And of course, so a dialogical interspecies ethics would view others as subjects, as agentic subjects, who are not inferior to us. So it's egalitarian, it's context specific, for instance, and it's based on an openness and care and attentiveness to the needs of others. So it's also, so she draws a lot on feminist care ethics. She gives an example of, for instance, of if she had a balcony and there was a poisonous snake on it, and she says you wouldn't immediately approach the snake and murder it. So if you had a human camping out on your balcony, your first response wouldn't be to kill it. It would be to try to find a way to sort of move them to a safer place or find a way to negotiate things. The same approach would apply if you had a venomous snake. And it would depend on who was there first. So if you had been living in a particular place and the snake was moving into this area, you might have a claim, and therefore you could try to find a way to get the snake to move along. So it's about treating others with this kind of respect, and others in this sense, including anything else you might encounter. So just to sort of wrap up, I'm interested, as somebody who's interested in environmental ethics, as this notion, this recurring idea of this rigid dualism. So not only between humans and animals and society and nature, but of course we see this around gender relations, around issues of race. These are long-standing constructs that underpin certain approaches to the world, and these are quite problematic, and that we need to critically reflect on and address. And they're much more important than ever before, especially during the various upheavals that we're seeing in the Anthropocene. So notions of the self, the social, the polis need to be reconceptualized to capture the entangled nature of reality, and that to deconstruct these hierarchies that place anything, whether it's a human, a woman, a man, a white person, above everything else. These things need to be radically deconstructed. And of course, this is no easy task. But I think Plumwood offers a helpful approach to this. When navigating the terrain ahead, whether it's approaches to urban redesign, to policy, interspecies relations, academic inquiry within sociology, for instance, should be underpinned by an understanding, first of all, that humans are always in relation, and that they're never separate from or above other species, and that other species, other things, beings, non-humans are agentic. They have power, they have different ways of constructing the world, and they are thoroughly constitutive of the social. And lastly, that dialogical interspecies ethics is predicated on this notion of respect and care for others rather than exploitation and domination, and that this offers a potentially fruitful way forward while we kind of learn to navigate the terrain ahead.
Thank you, Heather. We have to cut you off there because you're well over time, and we do need to make some room for Catherine. So thanks, everybody. If you have any comments, comments. I'm thinking in teacher mode right now. If you have any comments, feedback, if you want to share this on Twitter, please use the chat function. And thank you again, Heather. Let's roll straight into Catherine.
Thank you.